When people ask me about Stalingrad, they usually expect stories about heroic tank duels, snipers in the ruins, or epic assaults. But I don't remember the shooting. If you ask me what Stalingrad is, I will answer, it is the taste of glass and blood on the lips. I was a field medic. In the winter of '42, the frost in the city dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius. Everything froze, even the medical supplies. The morphine ampules would just shatter right inside my medical bag from the bitter cold. And without morphine, the wounded soldiers, boys my own age, simply went mad from the pain, screaming so loud it made your ears ring. So I would take the whole ampules and put them in my mouth. I kept them under my tongue, in my cheek, to thaw them with my own body heat. Sometimes I would crawl for hours through the basements or factory ruins with a mouthful of glass ampoules. I was afraid to swallow or take a sharp breath, terrified the glass would crush and slice my throat. That ice-cold taste. It is still with me. Every time winter comes, I feel it. You know, the most terrifying part is that we went there as conquerors. I was 19. We were such naive idiots.
By the late summer of 1942, the German military machine seemed absolutely unstoppable. The Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, the elite of the Wehrmacht, numbering over 300,000 battle-hardened soldiers, was rapidly advancing across the southern steppes toward the banks of the Volga. Their main objective was the city that bore the name of the Soviet leader, Stalingrad. The German High Command promised its troops a swift, crushing victory. Propaganda assured them that the Red Army was completely exhausted, and that this would be the last major battle on the Eastern Front.
We truly believed it. Our march toward the Volga in August felt like some easy stroll. The sun was shining. We ate fresh watermelons we found in the fields, laughed, sang songs, and wrote letters home saying the war would be over by Christmas. The commanders didn't even make us bring our heavy winter greatcoats. What for? We planned to be drinking schnapps in Berlin by December. When the older soldiers, the ones who survived the winter near Moscow a year earlier, told us to prepare for the worst, we just brushed them off. We thought the Russians were broken. We thought we were invincible. But when we finally reached the outskirts of the city and saw the river, the city didn't greet us with white flags. It greeted us with fire, which very quickly turned all our pride to ash.
By September 1942, the German army entered the city limits, expecting a swift mop-up operation. But the Luftwaffe's massive bombing campaigns had already reduced Stalingrad to an apocalyptic labyrinth of rubble, twisted metal, and shattered concrete. This unintentional fortress completely neutralized the German advantage in tanks and mobile warfare. The battle mutated into something entirely new and horrifying. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. It was a brutal, grinding, close-quarters slaughter for every street, every house, and every single floor.
The Rat War. Whoever coined that term was absolutely right. We stopped being human beings in those ruins. We became animals fighting in the dirt over scraps of broken concrete. Out in the open steppes, our tanks and artillery made us feel like gods. But inside the city, a tank was just a steel coffin waiting for a Russian boy with a Molotov cocktail to drop it from a second-story window. I remember my first day inside the Red October factory. The noise wasn't just loud, it was a physical weight crushing your skull. You couldn't tell where the Frontline was anymore. The Frontline was a ruined staircase. We would hold the first floor, the Russians would hold the second, and we would shoot at each other through the holes in the ceiling. You couldn't sleep, you couldn't breathe without choking on brick dust. As a medic, I quickly realized how useless I was in that environment. How do you drag a wounded man through a narrow hallway that is zeroed in by a sniper? You don't. You just listen to him bleed out 10 feet away from you, crying out for his mother. I remember a young corporal, Dieter Kaufmann was his name. He was shot in the stomach in a ruined kitchen on the 3rd floor of an apartment block. I couldn't reach him without getting my head blown off. We threw him bandages across the debris, but his hands were too weak, too slick with blood to tie them. He begged us to shoot him to end it. We didn't. We just sat behind a broken wall, gripping our rifles, listening to his voice grow weaker for 6 agonizing hours. That was the exact moment the illusion shattered. I realized the radio broadcasts were a lie. There was no glory here. We were not going to drink schnapps in Berlin for Christmas. We were all going to die in this dust.
In mid-November 1942, the trap sprang shut. In a massive counter-offensive codenamed Operation Uranus, Soviet forces smashed through the weaker Romanian and Italian flanks, completely encircling the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Over 250,000 men were suddenly cut off from the world. As the supply lines were severed, the infamous Russian winter, General Frost, arrived with a vengeance, dropping temperatures to lethal extremes.
We heard the distant rumble of heavy artillery behind us to the west. That's when the whispers started in the trenches. We are cut off. The Russians are behind us. But the officers kept telling us to stay calm. They read us daily messages from the Führer promising that Goering's Luftwaffe would supply us from the air and that General von Manstein was coming to break the siege. It was all a massive lie. The supply planes rarely made it through the flak, and when they did, they sometimes dropped ridiculous things, condoms, black pepper, and summer uniforms instead of bread and ammunition. But hunger wasn't our worst enemy yet. The cold was. The temperature plummeted so fast it felt like the air itself was trying to kill you. I watched the proudest, most disciplined army in the world turn into a horde of armed beggars in a matter of weeks. We had no winter gear. None. Men were wrapping their freezing feet in old newspapers and bloody rags. I saw elite infantrymen wearing stolen Soviet women's shawls, torn curtains, even pieces of dirty carpet tied around their waists with copper wire just to stop the biting wind. As a medic, I almost stopped treating bullet wounds. My days were spent looking at blackened dead toes and fingers. Frostbite doesn't scream like a gunshot wound. It just silently rots the flesh while the man is still alive. I had to amputate toes with a standard medical knife without any anesthetic, while the soldiers just stared at the peeling wall with hollow eyes. They didn't even cry anymore. The cold had frozen their tears and the hunger had eaten their souls.
By December 1942, the air bridge promised by Hermann Goering had completely collapsed. The Luftwaffe had guaranteed 300 tons of supplies a day, but barely delivered a fraction of that. Inside the tightening pocket, the German Sixth Army was starving, freezing, and dying from typhus and dysentery. The medical system broke down entirely. Cellars and ruined department stores became makeshift hospitals. Dark, freezing pits, of human suffering, where doctors and medics were forced to make impossible choices.
By Christmas, I was stationed in the basement of the ruined Wehrmacht department store in the center of the city. We called it the Catacombs of the Damned. There was no electricity, just the flickering light of a few kerosene lamps and candles made from animal fat. The smell. God, the smell is something you can never wash out of your memory. It was a thick, suffocating mixture of dried blood, human excrement, rotting flesh, and unwashed bodies. We had hundreds of men lying on the bare, freezing concrete floor, packed so tightly you couldn't walk without stepping on someone's ruined leg or arm. We ran out of clean bandages by the second week of December. We started taking bloody bandages off the dead, washing them in melted snow and putting them straight onto the living. But the lack of supplies wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sorting. Every morning, the head doctor and I had to walk through the sea of moaning bodies. We had to play God. If a man had a severe stomach wound or missing limbs, we put a black mark on his forehead with a piece of charcoal. It meant no food, no water, no medicine. Save the resources for those who can still hold a rifle. I remember a boy, maybe 17, grabbing the edge of my coat. He had a black mark on his forehead. He whispered, "Please, just a drop of water." My mother is waiting for me. I had to pry his frozen fingers off my coat and walk away in silence. That breaks you. It breaks your soul into pieces. And above us, the Russians never stopped. The psychological terror was relentless. The absolute worst was the sound of the Soviet rocket launchers. We called them Stalin's organs. It started as a low, terrifying howl, like metal tearing the sky apart, and then the earth above us would erupt in fire and thunder. Every time they fired, the entire basement shook, and the brick dust from the ceiling would rain down on the open wounds of the dying men, and they would start screaming all over again. There was nowhere to hide. You just sat in the dark, covered in other men's blood, waiting for the ceiling to crush you.
By mid-January 1943, the situation for the Sixth Army was terminal. The Soviet forces were relentlessly squeezing the pocket, slicing the German defenses into isolated pockets of resistance. Potomnik Airfield became the center of the universe for the trapped soldiers. It was the last functioning airstrip, the only remaining lifeline to the outside world. Thousands of starving, frozen, and wounded men dragged themselves toward the snow-covered runway, driven by a desperate, animalistic instinct to escape the slaughter. But there were far too many men and far too few planes.
The road to Potomnik. It wasn't a road anymore. It was a graveyard of frozen steel and frozen men. You didn't need a map to find the airfield. You just followed the trail of abandoned trucks, dead horses, and the frozen corpses of soldiers who had simply sat down in the snow to rest and never got up. When my medical unit finally reached the airstrip, I thought I was hallucinating from the hunger. It was absolute pandemonium. The runway was cratered by Soviet bombs, and the wrecked carcasses of Junkers transport planes lay everywhere. Whenever a plane actually managed to land, a mob of desperate men would rush it. Military discipline had completely evaporated. I saw officers threatening to shoot their own men just to clear a path to the aircraft doors. It was every man for himself. Then came the moment that still haunts my nightmares. My commanding officer handed me a piece of paper, a boarding pass. I was ordered to board the next Heinkel bomber to escort 3 severely wounded high-ranking officers back to Germany. It was a ticket out of hell. I looked around. Laying in the bloody snow right next to the runway were dozens of young soldiers I had been treating for weeks, boys with missing legs, boys coughing up blood. They were looking at me. They knew there was no space for them. As the engines of the Heinkel roared to life, the crowd surged forward. Military police were literally beating soldiers back with the butts of their rifles to let us through. I had to step over the bodies of the wounded to reach the ladder. As I climbed up, I felt a hand grab my ankle. It was a young infantryman, his face black with frostbite, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He didn't say a word. He just held onto my boot with the last strength he had. A military policeman smashed the boy's hand with his rifle, breaking his fingers so I could climb aboard. The heavy metal door slammed shut. As the plane lifted off the ground, I looked out the small, scratched window. The last thing I saw of Stalingrad was a sea of desperate men shrinking into tiny black dots against the endless white snow, waiting for the Russians. I survived. But I left my soul on that runway.
On February 2nd, 1943, the guns in Stalingrad finally fell silent. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered, defying Hitler's order to fight to the death. Out of the original 300,000 men of the Sixth Army, only 91,000 skeletal survivors marched into Soviet captivity. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The battle that was supposed to secure a 1,000-year empire became its graveyard.
I remember hearing the official radio broadcast back in Germany. The announcer said with solemn pride that the Sixth Army had fought heroically to the last man. That was another lie. They didn't fight to the last man. They starved and froze to the last man, abandoned by the leaders who sent them there. I was given a medal and a short leave before being sent back to another front. But the truth is, I never really left that city. I lived a long life after the war. I became a doctor, I got married, I watched my children and grandchildren grow up in a peaceful world. But you cannot simply pack up an experience like that and put it in a box. It changes the chemistry of your brain. Even now, 80 years later, I cannot sleep in a totally dark room. I cannot throw away a piece of stale bread without feeling a pang of intense guilt. And the cold never truly goes away. Sometimes I sit in my living room wrapped in a thick blanket right next to a roaring fireplace, and I start to shiver. Because in my mind, I'm back in the Univermag basement. I close my eyes and I still feel that young boy's broken fingers clutching my boot on the runway. People call us the lucky ones because we made it out. But survival is a heavy burden when you know the price someone else paid for your seat on that plane. War is not about glory or flags. War is an old man waking up screaming in the middle of the night because he can still taste the frozen glass on his lips.